Hello, everyone. Dr. Ames here. This time I'd like to talk to you about the ADA. Now, this was our first major piece of legislation directed absolutely at disabled persons in America. It came around in 1990. And the whole thrust of this piece of law was providing equal opportunity and reasonable accommodation for disabled workers. So we are really talking about the workplace here. Um, So the law spelled out a number of things that had really become more or less common practice, but laid out a framework for how employers should act and treat disabled workers. And so job descriptions have to be very specific, exactly what the requirements of the jobs are, and the tasks and so forth. If there is something physical that has to be done, it really has to be mentioned. It has to come out at the latest in the interviews, of course, but it should be in that job description itself when you place the ad. Um, it also said that extended the policy that's really been our policy from the government for a long time, that when you apply for a job, regardless of whether you're disabled, you do not have to provide a medical history of any type. You do not have to go through a medical screening. Now, there are certain occupations, of course, where this might be necessary, but you would know that up front because it would be spelling out the details in that specific job requirement when it is advertised. But the law really says that you are not supposed to have to even think about turning in any kind of information like that. As well, employers, if they give an employment test, whether it's a physical test or a sit-down test, whatever it might be at a computer console, they have to make a reasonable accommodation for people where that might be difficult just due to the physical environment. And these are not these sort of accommodations, to cost a lot or cause a onerous burden on the employer at all. They just mean take some reasonable accommodations, be helpful to people, and don't exclude them just because they might have a disability. In particular, they stressed for the first time that during job interviewing, um, be as neutral as possible. People certainly have many stereotypical thoughts about disabled people, and it's widespread. And we have some research to back up the fact that many HR professionals hold some of these stereotypical uh, beliefs about disabled people, and consequently, they get paid less and get hired less often. So the emphasis ought to be on having a fair and equitable job interview. Now, the thorny thing here is the cost of accommodation. There's a large myth out there that it's meant to hurt the employers and that they have to pay ridiculous costs that are probably onerous to accommodate a disabled worker. And this is simply not true. As you can see from the statistics I put here, uh, the cost of accommodation, uh, the great majority, 78%, costs less than $1,000. Now, if you're a big corporation or organization of some type, making a less than $1,000 accommodation, even if it got close to that amount, is certainly not going to be considered onerous to the company. Now, that might be different for a small employer, but there's nothing in the law that says a small employer has to do anything other than a reasonable accommodation. And so if we look at the facts here, what we see is that 15% of these accommodations don't cost anything. Sometimes you can change shifts, you can change hours, you can change the physical layout of equipment and desks and so forth. And so they cost nothing to do these reasonable sorts of things. About half, just slightly over half, cost only up to $500. And so certainly if half of the accommodations you're making are less than that, that's not onerous either. And so it's not really directed to hurt business in any way, but in other words, it's meant to really provide equal opportunity and access under the law for disabled people. As you can see here, about 12% run uh, that range from $501 up to the 1,000. And then there are less than a fourth that cost a little more than $1,000 or so. And certainly these aren't going to be small companies and so forth that are going to get involved in those sorts of things. The widespread myth that a company would have to redesign its entryways to put in self-touch button opening doors and ramps and costly things like that, maybe even an elevator, simply are not true. Now, if you were renovating your building, Certainly local business code, building codes around the country would say you've got to add in ease of access for disabled people under the ADA laws. But that's a different situation when you're building a building and you're renovating a building to get it up to current standards. There's nothing in the law that says that you have to spend an untold or an onerous amount of money to accommodate people. It's about being reasonable. Okay, folks, that's all I wanted to talk about this time. I'll talk to you again soon.